Fair Play Projects.
So now we have the pocket pleats attached to both of our skirt pieces, and we have the top and bottom hems folded and pressed. And we're ready to sew the side seams of our garment. Before we go ahead and sew them, what we want to do is actually reopen up these folds of the top and the bottom hem. Your crease line from pressing that hem should remain, but we want these opened up to sew our side seams. So here I'll open the top edge and the bottom. Now that we've got the top and bottom hems of both skirt pieces opened up, we'll stack the two skirt pieces on top of each other with right sides facing. So you see I've got one skirt piece here with the pocket attached, and I've got this stacked right on top. And now we're going to pin along this side edge for our side seam. And we want to line up the creases in the garment. So here I've got my top, the crease of my top fold, and I'm going to line those two up, and I'll put a pin in to keep those lined up as I work. And again at the second fold, the crease of the second fold. Now when we sew this side seam, we are going to sew down this straight edge of the side seam, and then we're going to go around the curved edge of our pocket. You may see here I've got a small blue dot. I've got three small blue dots. Actually, I've got one here, and one here, all transferred from my pattern pieces to mark points A, B, and C. These are going to be our pivot points for pivoting and sewing around the curved edge of the pocket. So as you sew down this side edge, when you reach this mark A, you'll pivot your machine to sew around this pocket curve. And then when you reach point B, you'll pivot again to sew this little straight line. When you reach point C, again, pivot your work and sew down the straight edge of the fabric. Once you've sewn all the way down to the bottom edge, you'll sew a zigzag stitch following those same turns and twists from the top edge around the edge of the fabric and all the way down, enclosing both layers of your seam allowance in a zigzag stitch right along the raw edge of the seam allowance. So now I've got the side seam of my skirt sewn. I started at the top edge here. I've got my straight line down to point A, where I've pivoted my work to come around the curve of the pocket. I've got my two more pivots at B and C, and then down the straight edge of the skirt to the bottom. And then I've also followed that same path with a zigzag stitch that holds in that raw edge of the seam allowance through both layers. Down straight here, around the curved edge of the pocket, and down to the bottom. Now I'm going to press this seam to one side. Now up until this point, we've been treating the front and back of our skirt as the same. We've treated them exactly the same, front or back. But at this point, you'll want to choose what you'll decide as the front side of the skirt. And you're going to press your seam allowance and your pocket toward the front side. So I've got my side seam is attached only on one side, so I can open this up flat. And I'm going to choose this side here as the front of my skirt. So I'll press my seam allowance and my pocket toward that side. I'll bring this over to my iron and I'll press it to that side. And now once I've done that, I can sew the side seam on the other side of my two skirt pieces. And once I've sewn my seam and my zigzag stitch, I'll press that seam allowance and that pocket also toward this side, which is now the front of my skirt. Now you see I've got my seam allowance and the pocket of the side seam pressed toward what is now the front of my garment. Now when I press that seam allowance toward the front of the garment, I ended up pressing open these top folds and the bottom folds of the hem. And I'm going to bring this back to my ironing board and refold and repress those creases so that they're nice and sharp again. So just fold that top one over and the bottom here of the top hem, and I'll do the same on the bottom. So now we have our top and bottom hems refolded and pressed. So we've got a nice straight line across the top and a nice straight line across the bottom. And there's our pocket folded toward the front. Now the last step in our side seam is going to be to sew a couple of tacking stitches down to hold this pocket in place and reinforce our seam. We're going to do that with the right side of the garment facing up. So excuse me while I flip this around. And here we have the right side facing up. Now you'll want to make sure that even after you've flipped it around that your pocket and your seam allowance are still pressed toward the front. And we're going to find that gap of our pocket. So the gap of the pocket starts right up here and ends down here. And we're going to sew 2 small tacking stitches, one at the top, one at the bottom, about 3/8 of an inch long, just going right across that seam line. So perpendicular to and across the seam line. To do that, you'll go into your machine and sew a short 3/8 inch seam straight across. You'll back stitch over that seam and then sew straight across again. So you're going to end up sewing over that same spot 3 times total. And just a real nice short seam right here at the bottom and right here at the top. So here is our finished side seam. We've got sewn all the way down around the pocket from the top to the bottom. Our top and bottom hems are refolded and we've got our tacking stitches perpendicular to our seam line. One here at the top of the pocket gap and one here at the bottom. Now once you've completed one whole side seam, you can do this all the same steps on the opposite side of the skirt.